Welcome to Combos from the Couch by LifeStance Health, where leading mental health professionals help guide you on your journey to a healthier, more fulfilling life. Hi, all. We know as the new school year approaches, the transition from summer freedom to classroom structure can be especially challenging for students with ADHD. I'm Nicolette Lianza, and today I'm joined by therapist Corey Grad, and he'll be sharing practical tips on how to ease the transition back and help students start the school year with confidence. So thanks for being here with me, Corey.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, we're going to jump right in. Let's start with tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to become a therapist.
Sure. My name is Corey Grad. I am an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been with LifeStance for about roughly 4 years now. How I got into therapy, and I'll keep this brief, it's rather interesting. I actually started more of pursuing a journalism major. Something was very fascinating about interviewing people, getting to know their stories, publishing it. But as time went on, I started to gravitate more towards literary analysis, and that caused me to seek out a BA in English from Loyola University. One of the things I really liked about literary analysis is some of the greats in the field could do a beautiful job of putting on the page some of the struggles and some of the triumphs of the human condition. But towards the end of my undergrad, I became very dry and analytic. The human component had started to go away. It was also around that time that certain life circumstances caused me to seek out my own individual therapy, and I found the process rather transformative. So immediately after graduating, I went back into school to pursue a degree in clinical social work.
Very cool. And it sounds like one of your specialties are ADHD.
ADHD is an interesting thing because it's been defined as many things, but sometimes the definitions get a bit murky.
The definition related to ADHD, do you mean? Well, let's so that here. Let me ask you that. So, as we start our discussion, looking at the transition back to help those ADHDers back to school. So, let's start with what is ADHD and how does it typically show up in children and teens?
I think that's a great question because if we're going to discuss strategy, it's important we have a shared definition of what that means because sometimes ADHD gets framed as a lot of things that it isn't. And if we're working from a flawed definition, that creates a lot of organizational problems when it comes to talking about strategy. One of the things I'll go off of when talking about ADHD is how is it defined in the DSM-5? The DSM-5 recognizes three different presentations of ADHD, which is predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, and a combined mixture of the two. The combined is actually the most common one clinically. And there are two clusters of symptoms when diagnosing this. There is the hyperactive cluster and the inattentive cluster. Hyperactive cluster has things like fidgeting, leaving their seat, talking excessively, difficulty waiting their turn. This is often what gets pictured the most when imagining someone with ADHD. On the inattentive side, there's things like difficulty sustaining attention, not following through in tasks, being easily distracted, and having trouble organizing. Something I think that's important to note if we're talking about this is that the inattentive presentation, the picture of the kid, the quiet kid staring out the window in class, tends to go unidentified longer because there's not as many visible symptoms at first. Also, a couple of things when it comes to diagnosing, symptoms have to show up across more than one setting. It can't just be just in one setting, it has to be multiple settings, and there has to be actual functional impairment. Having symptoms without them interfering in daily life doesn't really meet diagnosable criteria. One thing I also want to note about ADHD as well, when we're talking about symptoms of the DSM, something that many of my clients don't really get talked to about is the biological components of it. ADHD is technically considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. And what this means in practical terms is that the brain develops a little differently. Specifically, the prefrontal cortex, which covers impulse control, planning, and attention regulation, matures roughly 3 or so years behind their peers. And that's an important thing to note because if we're going to be talking about ADHD, I think it's important to note the biological components of it to give respect to the person's condition, but at the same time, not to make it overly biological because then that undermines the student's ability for self-regulation and self-mastery. One other thing about ADHD is that it has the words attention deficit in it, and that doesn't always do the best way of describing what happens. It's more of an attention regulation problem. Like the
Mm,
focus is there, it just doesn't take direction well. It's hard to point
it's a
it
good
to
way
where
to
you
put
need
it
to.
that way. It doesn't always take direction well. Yeah.
That's why you can have situations where a student of ADHD can spend 6 hours playing a video game, but have difficulty of doing 10 minutes of homework.
Right.
The brain engages, differently depending on the stimulation, and that's something we have to keep in mind if we're going to be talking about strategy.
Yeah. So, as we're looking at support for students with ADHD, so what does a strong support structure look like for them, and how do families go about building one?
Strong support structure, one of the first places we want to start is with an IEP, an individual education plan. That's actually a legally binding document that assures that the school has certain accommodations for students with conditions that meet the criteria for it. The school is obligated to provide accommodations. Accommodations for ADHD can include things like extended time, preferential seating, reduced distraction for settings for taking tests, assignment modifications, and check-in, check-out systems. The school is actively trying to help and engage with them. There's also things like a 504 plan, which is similar but slightly different. There's not as much active or directional approach. Certain accommodations can be made, but there's not someone actively checking in with them. When it comes to the IEP as a parent, one of the things you want to do is to be aware of how frequently it's being updated, what are the conditions for it, is it actually being carried out?
The important part right there is making sure it's being carried out. So, shifting it to parents, what parents can do to ease that transition back to school for their ADHDers? What are some practical strategies for that?
One other thing before I forget, as we
Oh,
talked
you
about what the
sure?
school can do, is
Yeah.
something that I think is important is medication management. If your child is linked to a psychiatrist or medication provider to help reduce some of the symptoms, because that has shown to be effective in some ways, but a few caveats with that. If your child is on stimulant medication, it needs active monitoring and not just renewing the script. Questions that parents should be exploring with the provider is the dosing right for school hours? Is there an afternoon drop that where focus falls off when the homework starts? Has the dose been reviewed as the child begins to mature and develop? Research on the topic has said that there's actually a landmark study by something called the MTA, the Multi-Model Treatment of ADHD study, published in 1999, that had nearly 600 kids in the study, and it said that medication plus behavioral interventions produce better outcomes across a wider range of functioning than just medication alone.
Okay. Key part there. Also the behavioral interventions as well. Definitely.
And one additional thing on top of that, and this one's a bit trickier to navigate, is making sure or talking to teachers to see how much awareness they have of their child's condition and how much they know about ADHD. There was
Mm.
a 2024 study that found that student or teachers had a harder time recognizing the symptoms of ADHD, and this isn't like a knock against teachers. The education system is rather complex and rather hectic, and sometimes it gets harder to pay attention to that. One of the things, if you have a child who's been diagnosed with ADHD, it's just been diagnosed, is to sit down with some other teachers and talk to them about their understanding of it and seeing what accommodations can be made in addition to the IEP or the 504 plan.
Key, definitely key there. Making sure teachers engaging their understanding of ADHD and stuff. So what can parents do then to help support their ADHDers?
Okay, so we've talked about the structural stuff, like what can the parents actively do? And it's important to look at what are the common difficulties or what are the things that prompt difficulties for a student with ADHD when at the start of a new school year. It's a bit of an abrupt change in some ways to go from no structured time, summer break, straight into now it's going to be very structured. Not only that, students with ADHD really thrive on routine. You have to now construct a new routine, different classrooms, different schedulings. In addition to, there's going to be an increased cognitive demand on them from increasing difficulty of academic material. How do the parents get ready for that? First things first, let's look at what the parents can do. One thing that has come up is something known as behavioral parent training, and this is actually a very researched psychosocial intervention for childhood ADHD, and it breaks down into two types of techniques. The first is antecedent based. basically setting up for success before the behavior happens. In
Mm.
practice, one instruction at a time, not a chain of directions, predictable daily routines so the child knows what's coming, something like 5-minute warnings before transitions happen rather than abrupt switches, and making the desired behavior the path of least resistance before the moment of conflict arrives. And what this can mean that if you are working with a child, it's time to do homework, saying, okay, it is time to do homework now. You're making sure there's no distractions in the environment. And if they are coming back from school, giving them a kind of a brief cool down period of maybe
Yeah.
5 minutes and everything being very structural. The other level is consequence based, and this is responding to behavior after it happens. And the most important thing the research tells us here is about timing. Students with ADHD, their brains strongly prefer immediate over delayed rewards. The connection between a behavior and a consequence that comes days later is generally weak in response to people with ADHD. A reward on Friday for behavior on Monday doesn't really land the same way.
Mm.
The consequence, positive or negative, needs to happen as close to the behavior as possible. Specific, immediate praise the moment a desired behavior occurs. And that's not really a parenting opinion. That's actually how the dopamine system of the brain works. And that's what the research shows gets the best results. One thing that doesn't get said enough, and I want to make sure this is clear for the parents, that raising a child with ADHD can be generally stressful. There's research showing that. Research actually shows it particularly produces more inconsistent parenting, harsh responses, lower consequences, and more negative perceptions of the child over time. And I'm not saying this as a knock against parents. It can be a challenge. There is a model out there called behavioral parent training that helps break that cycle and offers training to parents on how to better work with their kid and some of the symptoms that come up along with regulating their own responses to it.
Great, great. Okay. So shifting from parents' side to what are some tips for high school and college students with ADHD? Some specific things they can do to help themselves transition back?
With students, the first thing to look at is how are we going to go about structuring and dealing with challenges that come up in a way that's congruent with ADHD. When I worked with quite a few clients who've had ADHD, there is a tendency to try to kind of brute force their way through sheer willpower alone. And that can maybe work in the short term, but over the course of a school semester, it eventually comes crashing down. Some strategies that can work. One can be having, depending on where you're at in terms of school level, a two-pocket folder, a to-do pocket and a turn-in pocket. Completed homework assignment goes directly into the turn-in pocket the moment it's finished, and that eliminates the decision of where to put it. If you're definitely going to want to try to set up, and maybe with some assistance from your parents, having a consistent after-school routine. The same sequence every day, something like snack, homework, free time. Brains of ADHD struggle with unstructured transition time. A predictable sequence removes the decision paralysis that often leads to procrastination, especially for high school and college level students. Breaking long-term assignments into same-day steps. The
Mm.
ADHD doesn't connect well to future deadlines. It responds well to what's in front of it.
Yep. Yeah. I
And
think
if
that's a key point to make right there. It responds to what's in front of it. Yeah.
one of the things that gets tricky with that is I've worked with clients where they're quite intelligent and they can whip up a paper relatively quick. If the paper is due Thursday, it's Wednesday night, we can get it
Right.
done, and they manage to pull it off. And they reach an
Right.
unfortunate kind of tipping point at which they progress further and further into their academic career,
Right.
where that isn't feasible. You could do that in high school,
Right.
but if you have a large paper in college,
So then I feel like I see that quite a bit. Maybe in high school, those study habits or getting the work done how they used to back then, that would work for them. Maybe translation to college does not obviously translate well. So it is shifting gears and doing it differently according to your ADHD brain. Yeah, I hear ya.
one thing that I've seen in some of the research, and I think this is very relevant for our listeners, is that sometimes people can have ADHD and they can go through high school and it doesn't really get noticed because there's like a lot
Right,
of structure in place that the school provides. And it's not until they start to get into environments where there's less external structure that these things start to appear, that someone goes through their entire high school career, gets to college, and then they're having struggles, and all of a sudden they find themselves diagnosed with ADHD, wondering, did something suddenly happen? It's like, it's always been there. It's just the things that were cropping up have gone away, and now it's landing more on the individual to try and manage it. Getting back on the topic of organizational skills, something that's been, very valuable, and the research has shown it works well, is having timer-based work blocks that 20 or 25 minutes on, 5-minute breaks. That reduces the feeling of endless obligation that can trigger complete shutdown. That some of the clients I've worked with have had an all or nothing approach when it comes to assignments, that they see that the project has to get done that day or it's not getting done at all.
Yeah. So, what are some, jumping back to parents and even teachers, what are some common mistakes parents or educators make when supporting students with ADHD?
Sure. I think for going on, I think you mentioned school staff. One thing that school staff would help them with is having structured, predictable schedules that reduce the cognitive load of transitions. If that's overlooked, then you're essentially putting a lot of the load onto the client, and they're not really sure maybe how to manage it. One research finding worth knowing is that on task behavior in students with ADHD worsens progressively over the school day. Academic instruction is usually better placed in the morning with more active, less cognitive demanding work in the afternoon. One structure that or one mistake that can, parents can make with that is not having a structured routine, not having immediate rewards or punishments happen at the time of intervention. That if you tell your child, just sit down and focus, they're trying, but they need a structure. They need like an environment that supports that.
I agree. I think sometimes parents or teachers might think that the ADHD or is purposely being maybe oppositional when really they're not able to do it. They're not trying to not listen or whatever. They're doing the best they can. So I think sometimes adding in that patience and understanding more that they're not trying to be difficult, that there might be just truly this inability to obviously focus or organize themselves or turn in their homework on time and things like that. I think that's very important to acknowledge and recognize for sure.
And a few other things I want to make sure when it comes
Yeah.
to mistakes, and again, this isn't criticizing, it's just helping people avoid pitfalls. A thing that often comes up that I've seen with both parents and students alike is treating the difficulties of ADHD as being a motivation or an attitude problem. Like you just have to try
Mhm.
harder, or you got to sit down and focus, and understanding why it happens. There are clearly moments where the student can focus and produce work. So from the outside, it can look like they're not trying. How can they focus in one situation but not the other? But asking a student whose prefrontal cortexes are maturing 3 years behind their peers, it to simply try harder isn't really, that
Right.
isn't really respecting that.
I agree. I agree. So,
A few other
yeah,
factors I just want to make sure is that,
yeah,
go
please.
up the administering of consequences, positive and negative. It's important to have like punishment, negative consequences if something doesn't get done, but you also want to make sure it's appropriately balanced with positive reinforcement. You want to
Yes,
make sure that
definitely.
the only time that you bring attention to something is when something isn't getting done. That can reinforce a pattern I've seen in some clients where they start to see their ADHD as a curse, that they start to associate negative things with that part of their personality. Something that also can get overlooked too is not having home and school be siloed. And what I mean by that is research consistently shows like ADHD interventions work best when home and school are coordinated.
Mhm.
Like if there is a plan that it's in place with
Right,
the IEP, is it also being carried out at home? Is there
right,
communication between teacher and parent about what's best for
right.
them?
Yeah, that's probably one of the key things right there, for sure. And can I also make note that accommodations can also be helpful at the college level, at the university level as well. So I think it's not that necessarily that 504 or the IEP translates over to the college setting. It's more specifically the accommodations written by, a mental health professional who's treating the student. But I think sometimes people don't recognize you can get accommodations for your ADHD even at the university level. So I wanted to make note of that as well. So,
Sure. But that I think that's important to note because there's no, for people listening to this, there is, as you said, there's no 504 IEP in college. I think
right.
it's more in public schools. What students can do is they can self-register with disability service
Yeah.
office and
Hmm.
self-advocate with their each individual professor. Many students arrive never having managed their own accommodations and simply don't know like how to access them. And that really needs to happen before the semester starts and not after the first major problem or
Right.
academic or
Right.
on the topic of college, because that's
Yeah.
I think worth going into a bit too, because like high school and college are like two very different environments. Like something that you want to be aware of is that the college environment, as it's typically designed, is almost perfectly structured to dysregulate someone with ADHD. There's like late nights, unstructured
Right.
times, constant stimulation, not much external accountability other than your professors, but sometimes when that does come up, it's a bit too late. Naming that explicitly will help students make more intentional decisions rather than spending a semester feeling like they're falling apart or things are going wrong. It's important to know that how am I being aware of my environment? How does it interact with my symptoms? And what intentional choices can I make to shape my routine and my day? Am I making use of my supports in my environment that are available to me?
Very key. So, speaking of key, that's so out there. Is there one key takeaway you'd like listeners to remember about helping students with ADHD succeed this school year?
Sure. One key takeaway is that every strategy we've covered today, for parents, for students, for teachers, is doing the same thing. We want to engineer the environment so that the right choice becomes the path of least resistance. We're not asking the ADHD brain to be something it isn't. Not asking for more willpower or discipline. Those things are good, but that alone doesn't solve the problem. You want to design around how the brain actually works. You want to have strategies that are congruent with ADHD rather than just trying to plow through it. When you approach it that way, you stop fighting the child, the client
Right.
stops fighting that part of themselves and starts working with it. It becomes something that they accept as being part of them and not something they have to try to manage. And for any parent or student listening, back to school doesn't have to feel like a reminder of last year's struggles. It's one of the best natural reset points we have. You have new teachers, you have a new classroom, you have new routines. That this gives you a chance to start over on a fresh page, and not have to worry about what happened last semester and feel like you're really prepared to be successful this semester.
My gosh, Corey, thank you. You gave some amazing strategies to help parents, teachers, and students themselves navigate that back to school. So appreciate you and all your knowledge on this topic. You're definitely knowledgeable on this. Gave some really great tips. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
I'd also like to thank the team behind the podcast, Jason Clayton and Juliana Whitten. Thank you again for listening to Comments from the Couch. Take care, everyone.